I'm just going to jump right into it. Uh, there's a lot to look at here, and even if you see me talking about the St. Peter Street Cemetery before, I think I'll have some new things for you too tonight. So whether you're a resident or you're joining us from afar, you probably know that New Orleans is famous for its above ground cemeteries, these so-called cities of the dead that are scattered throughout historic neighborhoods, renowned for their architecture and sculptural elements, these distinct traditions of funerary decoration, and they're often cited as a kind of must-see destination for tourists. And many people, if you ask them what the oldest cemetery in the city is, they would name St. Louis Cemetery #1 as this kind of quintessential example of the New Orleans cemetery. And it's certainly one of the most famous of the city, appearing in movies like Easy Rider. That's fascination with St. Louis Cemetery #1 goes back to the 19th century, and the cemetery itself was founded in 1789. Of course, the modern city of New Orleans was founded much earlier than that. So obviously there are older places of burial, and these older cemeteries are our topic today. Though St. Louis #1 is going to come up again in this talk a little bit later, because it too, like the other cemeteries we'll mention today, has a forgotten element. So my focus in the talk today will be one particular cemetery, the St. Peter Street Cemetery, which was opened in the 1720s. And it's a cemetery where there are thousands of people still interred. It has been rediscovered many times over the years. And I led some excavations there in 2011 in advance of a swimming pool being built. So we'll talk a little bit about how that came to be, and I'll tell you about my research on the St. Peter Street Cemetery. I'm often quoted as saying that this is the city's first formal public cemetery. And there are a couple of reservations to that, though some of these are based on misconceptions, at least as far as we can tell. There's one of the most famous works on New Orleans cemeteries mentions sort of in passing that at the time of the city's founding, there were burials made along the riverbank. And this appears to be a reasonable assumption. Prior to the establishment of a regular plan for the city, the first settlers would kind of use whatever land was available to them for this purpose. Though it's not quite clear if this ever happened, or if there actually may have been a formal cemetery established in these first couple of years of colonial settlement. We'll get back to that a little bit later too, because that's one of the things that I'll address a little more later. We do know that there are burials beneath the parish church of St. Louis on the side of the present day St. Louis Cathedral in the colonial era. And that this space was utilized for the burials of important or influential individuals very early in the colony's history. There's a request granted to Ph.D., designer of the new church, to be interred beneath it prior to his death in 1726. So this practice was obviously happening very early in the city's history. And it was a practice that continued for the wealthy and influential, or for those with connections to church authority. The practice was directed to halt by the Cabildo in 1784 because of concerns over public health, but especially important people could always be an exception. And there are, to this day, the graves marked of Don Andres Almanestre y Rojas, the founder of the Charity Hospital, and of a prominent landowner, Francois Philippe de Mandeville. There are many more lesser known burials located in vaults beneath the present floor of the cathedral. Now, some of you may remember the interment of Archbishop Hannon, which I believe was the last burial actually within the church. But there's actually a series of catacombs beneath the church. And I was actually able to visit these catacombs back when we were doing the archaeological project in the garden behind the cathedral. I always include this the slide because this is probably the happiest you'll ever see me looking at a photo, and the most youthful in a long time, getting to go down and kind of explore beneath the cathedral. Monsignor Kern led us down to just see what was there. Most of these burials, or most of these vaults, are not marked. We don't know exactly who was buried there. We have some records that to associate with the burials there. But this was sort of the exception, really, throughout the 18th century. We do know of some other specialized burial places around the city. There, at least some maps mark a cemetery on the grounds alongside the barracks. And this was apparently a hospital and military cemetery that was later moved just outside of the walls of the city in the modern Forward Marigny neighborhood, and didn't last there for very long. It was soon eliminated by development too, but there may be remains of it there still. Really, the chief burial place for most of the people in the colonial city, really throughout the 18th century, though, was the St. Peter Street Cemetery. I always throw this one in too. There are occasional inaccuracies too. This was a map that was intending to show the St. Peter Street Cemetery, but it shows it in the wrong location. Where it actually is shown accurately here. It's the block that's today bounded by St. Peter, North Rampart, Toulouse, and Burgundy streets. And when it was established, this was the outer edge of town, actually beyond, beyond where the street grid had really been established. We know that it was there very early, and it was probably planned as part of that 1721 street grid that was laid out to guide the development of the city. By 1724, it's being described as having been elevated by the use of earth from ditches around it to raise the ground level, prior to it being surrounded by wooden palisades. And I always like to use this image because this is one of my favorite views of the early colonial city, this lasso view of the city from across the river. And of course, if you're looking for cemeteries, what's noticeable is that there aren't any visible. However, if we look back at the 1731 map and then go back and look here, I think we do have a sign of where the cemetery is established. We have this little pathway veering out at almost the same location as it shows up on the 1731 Gaussian map. I believe that pathway is going out to the St. Peter Street Cemetery. We also have it documented by 1725. It originally occupied only half of the block. And there are some suggestions that it may have already been closed because of overcrowding as early as 1729. By the 1780s, it was definitely overfilled. And there are accounts that state that new graves couldn't be dug without hitting others. The city had grown to encompass the block by that time, and people were becoming concerned about noxious odors, miasmas emanating from it. After the Good Friday fire of 1788, which destroyed so much of the city's housing stock, health and sanitation became an increased concern, and the overcrowded St. Peter Street Cemetery site became impossible to ignore. The Cabildo was informed that the cemetery was so overcrowded that there was simply no more room for burials in October of 1788. And soon afterwards, a new site had been selected to the rear of the Charity Hospital to move the cemetery, to move the chief burial place. It took a while for that move to happen, though. Uh, and we see complaints and debate going back and forth between the church and the Cabildo over the use of the old cemetery throughout the 1790s. In a letter to the Cabildo in 1797, the Attorney General of the city, Don Pedro Dulcido Baran, complains of the return of the harmful and obnoxious custom of the burial of the dead in the church, in St. Louis Church, which became the cathedral. But he also requested that the Cabildo officially prohibit any further burials there or in the old cemetery because people were still using it, even though the new cemetery had been established. The city began to sell off the lots that had formerly comprised the cemetery in 1801 via public auction. And development began of the former cemetery very rapidly after that. And most of the square was developed by 1820. People always ask how this happened. And we actually have a great deal of documentation of the process. The church had actually initially acted to sell the land after its closure. And then the Cabildo claimed the right to, and there was this legal battle back and forth between the church and the Cabildo over who was the proper owner of the St. Peter Street site. Bishop Peñalver claimed that even though the church did not have any formal title to the land, he had the sworn testimony, and this is quoting his account, the sworn testimony of 7 old men of unimpeachable character that the church had owned this land for more than 50 years, whereas the Cabildo countered that it had always been municipal property that had just been used by the church at the discretion of the city. And in an interesting letter that we'll return to at the end of this talk today, the Cabildo claims that the city cemetery had actually been moved around a few times over the course of the 18th century. And this might have some key information if we're looking for forgotten cemeteries. This legal dispute was eventually decided in favor of the Cabildo, but the bishop simply refused to move any of the burials while this was being appealed to the Spanish crown. Some of the letters back and forth, the excuses that are being come up with by the bishop to not move burials, that the weather is too hot out, that it's too muddy. It would have been a very unappealing job if it had have happened, but it pretty clearly did not happen. The crown never got a chance to rule on this legal dispute, and it still wasn't resolved at the time of the retrocession to France. And then when the new American authorities took over, they briefly reviewed this dispute and decided that the sale had been legal and that people could go ahead and begin developing the property. And everyone seems to have pretty quickly forgotten about about how many below ground burials there were there. All the burials at the St. Peter Street site were below ground. So who was buried there? Well, we have a good bit of documentary evidence about this, but it's not complete at all. And we know that the St. Peter Street site served all segments of New Orleans Catholic society, and that people of African, of Native, and of European descent, and any mixture of these, were all buried within its boundaries, whether free or enslaved, provided that they had been baptized. In 1731, a partial register of burials that exists, and there are pretty good registers between 1724 and 1734. A 1731 partial register of burial lists 87 individuals that are a pretty good cross-section of the city's colonial period residents who would have been being interred in the St. Peter Street site. enslaved Africans, free people of color, individuals from France and from Canada, an enslaved Native American woman. This is kind of a cross-section of New Orleans society at that time. And other records from this era give us really poignant reminders of the importance with which burial in the sanctified ground of the cemetery was regarded. This document is, I think, one of the most striking ones in this regard. It's a 1738 petition to the Superior Council in which an enslaved girl was to have her body exhumed and reburied within the boundaries of the cemetery. A petition made to Monsieur de Salmon, the Commissioner Ordinataire and first judge of the Superior Council. In it, Father Matthias reports that Monsieur Lequet de la Pommeraye, the Treasurer General, had his slaves bury the body of a girl of 12 or 13 years old outside of the cemetery in his garden, contrary to the ordinance of the king and the Code Noir, by which His Majesty wills and intends that masters are obliged to inter the bodies of their baptized slaves in the cemetery with the ceremonies of the church. Father Matthias demanded that the body be exhumed and reinterred in the cemetery with appropriate church rites, and that de la Pommeraye also be cited before the Superior Council. And justice appears to have proceeded relatively quickly in this case. And Salmon issued an order the same day that the body be exhumed and that de la Pommeraye be cited. Monsieur Fleuriot, the Attorney General, soon afterwards ordered that de la Pommeraye be fined and prohibited from relapsing into a like infraction. And of course, here there's so much behind the document that we can only speculate on what led de la Pommeraye to inter this young enslaved woman in his garden to begin with, what happened to her to bring about her demise. And so it's one of those fragmentary documents that tells so much more beneath the surface, I think. In my own research on the cemetery, I did a little bit of my own demographic research, looking at the burial registers from the 1770s and 1780s, which survive in the archives of the Archdiocese today. And although some are damaged and some are incomplete, they provide even more kind of fascinating information about the colonial makeup of New Orleans. By this time, although in the French period, both free and enslaved, African descended or Native or European descended are all in the same register. By this period, there are separate registers for the Blancos and the Gente de Color. And then Gente de Color are characterized into a number of different categories: Negro, Mulatto, Grifo, Cuataran, and Indio, all of which are included in this Gente de Color category. Even though technically Native American indigenous slavery was prohibited by this time, what we can see in these registers is that there are many Indios who are still enslaved, even into the Spanish period. Now, many people have looked in detail at these funeral registers for genealogical information, for the register of Blancos, of free whites in the colony. But there's a wealth of information in the registers about really New Orleans society for the Gente de Color in the late 18th century, and things that give clues as to people's social identities. In February of 1766, there's Luis Mestizo Libre Panadero, a baker listed. the names sometimes give indications of possible birth in Africa, like that of a Francisco Congo, a slave of the Capuchin fathers who died in 1775. This gets outside of my specialties and into the specialties of colonial historians, of which I don't consider myself one, but it's really there's a lot more I feel like that could be done with some of this information. There are some interesting things, though, that we can note that might have relevance to my own specialty, to looking for cemeteries and burial places. In the Spanish documents, the terms cementerio and campo santo are both used for places of interment. And in both cases, the deceased are noted as being interred in sepultura, in a grave, in one or the other. But there seems to be really no pattern to how these terms are used. I know that in some of the Spanish colonies, Campo Santo is used specifically as a reference to a burial place for the indigent, but it doesn't really seem to be the case here. And I'm not sure why the different terms are used, and so I'm always curious about that. At any rate, we know that by the late 1790s, burials in the St. Peter Street site had stopped. And then we began to see it show up again in its rediscoveries. So looking at the modern streetscape of the St. Peter Street Cemetery, the block that it occupied, and I think we can say with certainty now that there were burials across this entire block when it was in use. It's a very densely developed block of the French Quarter. And for those of you who've been around here for a while, the reference point that I always use is where Mama Rosa's Pizza used to be. I went there for years when I first arrived in the city without knowing that it was on top of a cemetery. You'll see also this big complex of the Maison du Puy Hotel up in the corner. We actually see unintentional discoveries of human remains on this block going back all the way to the late 19th century. There's a reference on Toulouse Street in 1893 of someone digging a well and finding 3 coffins at the property. There are some other mentions too of people during routine work in the 19th century, finding coffins, finding human remains, and then realizing that they're on top of the old cemetery and just kind of moving on with their lives. This is basically what happened in the 1970s as well, when the St. Peter Street site was rediscovered then. During excavation for a swimming pool at the Maison du Puy Hotel, a bottle collector who was there looking for privies for old outhouse pits, which are a good source of antique bottles for relic hunters, which is, for someone like me, an archaeologist, is its own problem. But that person found a number of coffins, and there's very little information about what became of the discovery of these coffins. The Orleans Parish Coroner's Office was called, and I've checked the coroner's day books, and I can find no reference to them coming out and investigating the site. And once it was determined that it was a historic cemetery, nothing else seems to have happened, and we can only speculate what became of the bones that were found at the time. By the time the St. Peter Street site was discovered again, in 1984, the attitudes towards both historic cemeteries and unmarked graves, the attitudes had changed quite a bit, and it was a much bigger deal this time around. In this case, and this picture here of my predecessor at UNO, Richard Schenkel, is actually not from the St. Peter Street site. This is actually from the Locust Grove Cemetery up near the Magnolia CJ Peet housing project. And it was a cemetery that was built over with the Tommy LaFawn School in the early 1900s, and is another kind of forgotten cemetery around the city. But there were a number of projects in the city in 1984, 1985 that involved impacts to cemeteries, and were discussed together in this article that this picture is from. So in 1984, construction workers had uncovered coffins and human bones on this construction site. And really, it's just by luck that it was documented at all. What I've heard anecdotally is that one of the construction workers had got upset with his supervisor, and that worker called the newspaper, and then the newspaper came out and saw that there were literally skulls everywhere, and then began calling other people, trying to figure out who was legally responsible. Inspectors from the city attorney's office, from the city's Department of Safety and Permits, from the NOPD all visited the site. They issued a stop work order. Eventually, the Vieux Carré Commission, the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office, the Division of Archaeology, the Archdiocese all got involved, trying to figure out who was responsible for the human remains in the site, and what was the legal obligation to be done. Eventually, in a kind of compromise, archaeologists and forensic anthropologists from LSU were allowed to access the site and excavate only the human remains that had been exposed already by the construction. And they, from what I understand, were given little more than a weekend to salvage human remains from the site. They eventually identified 29 separate individuals, and the majority of them were identified as being people of African or of mixed ancestry. And the assumption at the time that they made was that wealthier people had been moved at the time that the block was being developed, but the poorest members of society had been left behind. And they interpreted many of the individuals whose remains they recovered as having been people who were enslaved in life. Some of the skeletons exhibited pathologies suggesting strenuous labor, possible shackling. Others had what's called Perry fractures. Perry fractures are these fractures of the forearm that heal, but that are associated with someone protecting themselves from violent blows. So at the time, it was seen as a very significant example of the osteobiology of an enslaved urban population, something that really hadn't been studied at this point. This is years before the work that was done at the African Burial Ground in New York, which is now one of the most famous examples of an urban enslaved population that has been excavated. In the 1984 excavations, the most remarked upon burial has been that of a man of African ancestry who was unique in a couple of ways. His mandibular incisors were modified with notching, suggesting the cultural groups of Central Africa. And he was also buried with a suite of religious medals linked by a woven silver chain and chaplet, and an oval medallion. These items had been lost after this excavation took place, but came back to light when we did our own work at the site. And this figure has been a source of much speculation. It's been suggested that he was an Atlantic Creole of mixed parentage and transcultural fluency. Looking back at these items that were interred with him, many of them have something to do with healing, and I think this in itself is significant. The St. Camillus of Lellis medallion is the most uncommon one. St. Camillus, this patron of nurses and healthcare providers, who was only canonized in 1746, giving us a hint as to the date of the burial. These items right now are actually in an exhibition on African American spiritual traditions at the Ogden, that's curated by the Neighborhood Story Project. So you can actually see them right now. They probably should have been reinterred with this man at the time, but we actually don't know what happened to all of the human remains that were recovered in this 1984 excavation. We thought that they were reburied in St. Louis number 1, but they don't actually all seem to be there. The project caused quite a stir at the time, as of the disputes over who had jurisdiction, and there was a lot of discussion of this, and Salvador Anselmo, the city attorney at the time, thought that there would be some kind of protections established for cemetery sites within the city, at least to require people to survey in advance of construction projects, but this never really happened. And the St. Peter's Street site was essentially forgotten again until my own project there. Sorry, I'm already worried about running out of time, and so I'm having to do a little editing on the fly here. I have so much to talk about with the St. Peter Street site that I have to condense a little bit. My own involvement with the St. Peter Street site began in 2011 when a property owner contacted Shannon Dowdy from the University of Chicago, saying that he was planning on building a swimming pool on a condominium that he was renovating, and he had seen the articles about the 1980s work and thought that it would be a good idea to make sure that that didn't happen in his project. The law had been considerably clarified since the 1980s. Contrary to popular belief, archaeologists these days generally try to avoid disturbing human remains unless they have to. And there are now very specific laws that govern how we interact with human remains, and that require certain kinds of permits to be in place and agreements about what's going to happen with any human remains recovered afterwards. So while construction was underway, we got permission and a permit to just do a single test unit at the site to see if there were still human remains preserved at this location where the owner wanted to put in his swimming pool. And sure enough, we uncovered the end of one coffin actually extending under the foundation of the building next door. And this meant that we had to refill everything and then do a consultation process with the state attorney general, with the state archaeologist. We had to send out notifications to federally recognized tribes and put out public notices and papers. And eventually we got permission to excavate only the remains that would be impacted by the planned construction project. And we were able to get the property owner to modify their plan to try to minimize impacts to the site. Our burial permit also specified what would happen afterwards, that the human remains recovered would go to the forensics lab at LSU and would eventually be reinterred in consecrated ground, since the one thing we did know about the people at this point whose remains we were recovering was that they would have been baptized as Catholic. I often leave this until the end and forget to just recognize all the people who worked on this project with me. For this project, we worked with a local cultural resource management company called Earth Search and the LSU Faces Lab. The excavations were done in July and August, and so it was definitely one of the most difficult to deal with sites where I've excavated over the years in New Orleans, because we had to deal with a number of very complicated problems to do this work. Removing any coffins uncovered, removing them intact was a priority, so that the skeletons, so that the skeletal material could be exposed at the forensics lab at LSU in a climate-controlled setting. You know, if waterlogged bone is exposed to air, it begins to dry very quickly and crack and spall and disintegrate. And considering that this was taking place in July and August, you can understand why this would be such a problem. The removal itself was a tricky process, and eventually we identified 20 burials in a space measuring about 20 feet by 10 feet. 4 of these were redeposited where an earlier grave had dug through an even earlier grave, and then the remains had been thrown back on top of that coffin. There were some outside of coffins altogether, and then others in well-preserved cypress coffins. And beneath this, there was actually another layer of coffins more deeply buried, but because they wouldn't be disturbed by the construction project, we left them intact. We were working in a very tightly enclosed space, and this made it very difficult to get around. It was slick, it was muddy, and water was constantly filling in. The burials were located beneath the water table, and add to that summer rain, afternoon showers. We had to constantly pump water out of the excavation, and it refilled constantly as well. The coffins, and you can see one there to the left, were not only waterlogged and thus very delicate themselves, and of course contained human remains, but they also fill with clay naturally, meaning that each weighs hundreds of pounds, and thus they can't be lifted without support. There's no room for heavy equipment on site, and so we had to figure out a way to do this by hand, and I'll just take you very briefly through the process here. We figured out that we could break the seal of the coffin with the clay beneath it with a piece of plexiglass, and then let water fill back in under it, and then use that to dislodge the coffins, and then transfer them onto a piece of scaffolding, and then tape them up and secure them, and then lift them out of the excavation area. It was amazing how good of condition that they were in after this time. The anaerobic environment beneath the water table preserves wood very well, and it also preserves skeletal material very well. Now, I usually try to avoid pictures of human remains in my talks about the St. Peter Street site, But in the remains we recovered, we had both adults and children, all of whom, for at least for people for whom ancestry could be determined, appeared to be people of either African descent or mixed African and Native American parentage. And I suspect that at least a few of the people whose remains we recovered were related in life. The only picture of human remains here is just to illustrate this weird occurrence where there were that attest to the overfilledness of the cemetery historically, where there were just human remains deposited back in the clay everywhere. And this has implications for this block as a whole, because we know this is most likely the case really throughout this block. There were very few material items located within graves. You know, bodies in the St. Peter Street Cemetery were probably simply washed and wrapped in linens. Perhaps the linens were pinned together in a shroud. There were very few things that indicated markers in the cemetery, although there were some examples of improvised markers. And you can see here this thing that looks almost like a cross that was buried upright at the head of a grave. And it turned out to be a strap hinge, an iron strap hinge that was being used as kind of an improvised cross with one of the graves. When we do find material items interred with people, here's showing the work of the forensics lab. Everything was x-rayed and drawn and then carefully exposed in the lab. So when we do find material items with graves, it suggests a special significance for those items, particularly when they're not just ordinary clothing-related items. At least one of the individuals whose remains we recovered seemed to have been buried in an undershirt marked by a line of simple bone buttons that ran down the front of the burial. Another included a single blue bead recovered from the head or neck area of the individual, probably something worn around the neck. You know, there's a long tradition of blue beads as spiritual and magical items in African and African American culture, things for warding off evil, and in a context of enslaved peoples, you know, single items like this could have a kind of profound importance. When we do find larger numbers of items, it tells us something very important about the culture of the people whose remains we're recovering. And in our excavations in 2011, the most telling example of this was a man who was 50 to 60 years old at the time of his death, a man of African descent, interred in a well-made and well-preserved cypress coffin with a single oyster shell buried at the head of the coffin, just outside of it. And inside the coffin with him was a pipe, a hand-built clay smoking pipe, and pieces of flint for lighting it, and a carnivore tooth, all of which were probably in a small bag that had been interred with him, which we could see from a buckle that would have been used to close it. This complex of items is significant both for how it registers in African and Native American cultural repertoires. You know, there are accounts going back to the 18th century of the importance of small bags with powerful objects in African American culture, Gregory bags, nation sacks, and the like, many of them with antecedents in West and Central Africa. But there are also similar sources in Native American culture. John Swanton, in a study of the Indians of the southeastern US in 1946, noted that many indigenous men carried bags and bundles with tobacco and tinder and flint and pipes and other personal belongings that were seen as being contemporary versions of medicine bundles. magical bundles that materialize guardian spirits. And this is something that perhaps we can see extended into the colonial era as well. When it comes to the people interred in the St. Peter Street Cemetery, we'll likely never be able to make one-to-one links with those buried at the St. Peter's site and those whose names we find in colonial records. But we might look at remains like those of the men with the religious medallions recovered in 1984 and think about stories like that of the free man of color, Francois Tiesson, who petitioned the directors of Charity Hospital to grant freedom to his wife, Marie Haran, in 1744. And Tiesson had made an agreement with the directors of the Charity Hospital to work without remuneration for 7 years for the hospital, provided that at the end of that term, his wife, his enslaved wife, would be given her freedom. And this request was granted to him. Someone like Tiesson used his cultural literacy to negotiate these overlapping social worlds of colonial society to free his family. And perhaps this is something that we're glimpsing in the remains of the individual from the St. Peter's site. I know I've already gone long here, and so I'm just going to mention a couple of things to wrap up. I'm happy to say that we were able to put together a wonderful reburial ceremony for the remains recovered in 2011, working with St. Augustine Catholic Church, with the Office of Cemeteries, the Office of Black Catholics, to have both a mass, a memorial mass, and ceremonies at the grave site where the remains were reinterred to honor the African, the Native, and the Catholic descent of the people whose remains we recovered. And this was a very important thing to mark the significance of the occasion, I think. And there were a lot of people who made that happen, notably Linda Harris and Sabrina Mays, working with St. Augustine. I had a lot more to say about that ceremony and about all the people involved, and I can answer some questions about it at the end of this. But I don't want to finish tonight without talking about a couple of final notes on unearthing forgotten and lost cemeteries. You know, in an urban setting, there are often many examples of historic cemeteries that have been built over and are periodically rediscovered. And often the legalities involved in this are complex. Louisiana law, as distinct from federal laws and regulations, things like NAGPRA and so on, Louisiana law generally holds that the cemetery dedication exists in perpetuity unless it is formally removed. And that removal process involves removing all human remains from a site. That's actually a very restrictive provision of Louisiana law, but in a practical sense, it's very difficult to enforce. And there may always be unexpected encounters with those who came before us on the land. Based on the research we have now, I believe we can go beyond a general sense that anywhere could be a cemetery. We know that urban cemetery locations were closely regulated, and that there are specific examples we can document of their being reduced in size. Take St. Louis Cemetery number 1. We know that it was larger in the 19th century. And we know that there are a number of times when construction around it has impinged on it, where construction on Basin Street ran into it in the early 1900s. And now more recently, we're testing in the former Iberville housing project has found that it did in fact extend into many adjacent parts of Iberville. Sometimes these things give us clues about other cemeteries too. For instance, this article from 1908 mentions that the original cemetery of the French city um, was in the square of Rampart, Burgundy, Toulouse, and St. Peter, the St. Peter Street Cemetery. But it also mentions one on the corner of Royal and Conti Streets, where the transfer and mortgage office is now. I've never found any independent corroboration of that, except for in that dispute between the church and the Cabildo over the sale of the lots that that had comprised the St. Peter Street Cemetery. And there's a reference to a cemetery that was on the block or square that forms the corner of Bienville and Charter Street. In other words, what would be the opposite corner of that Royal and Conti block. And so if we remember some of the early maps of clearing around the city of New Orleans, there's this famous map that shows the first land cleared in the city, and that shows this area kind of along Conti Street coming out from the river. So I'm now thinking that this may be that first mystery cemetery on the river's banks. So what next? And I promise I'm wrapping up here. Thank you for your patience and sticking with me. Like I said, I have too much to say about the St. Peter Street site, and so much more to say about all of these things. One of the important things to think about here with the St. Peter Street site, and with probably many of the other forgotten cemeteries, is the disproportionate number of forgotten below ground burials that were those of people who were on the margins of society in their lives, particularly those who were enslaved. Even though a place like the St. Peter Street site served everyone in the colonial city, it's probably not a coincidence that so many of the human remains found so far are people of African descent. And this is something that's probably true in many of these other still half forgotten sites. And we're now working on some projects with the city of New Orleans to more comprehensively map these spaces. And I'm hoping that we'll be embarking on a project in the spring to do a series of markers for some of the places where we know enslaved people were buried and that are now unmarked, but that deserve to be marked and that deserve to be protected. Father Ledoux's Tomb of the Unknown Slave at St. Augustine Catholic Church was a noble first attempt at this, but now we can begin to see the reality of the situation around the city, and we can mark and memorialize these places more effectively than ever before. So thank you, everyone, and I'll stop there. And I'm happy to answer some questions from the chat or from all of you. And as Heather was saying, if I don't get to some of the questions, or if you have questions you'd like to email me, or if you'd like to hear more about our efforts, then you're welcome to email me. I've got my email address listed there. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gray. That was really fantastic. We've already started getting a bunch of questions coming in through the chat, so I'll start with those. If anyone else has any questions, please just write it into the chat, and then we'll try to get to as many as we can tonight without staying all night. So the first question, has anyone ever translated the funeral books for the enslaved and people of color and indigenous information out of those registries and have it translated and available to the public? And then what's the typical information contained within those registries?
Yeah, so the typical information is there will be some indication of the racial status. Because it's the Spanish period, they're using this casta system, and at least a kind of simplified version where terms like grifo and mestizo have a technical meaning of a certain degree of European African and or Native American ancestry. So there'll always be some kind of designator there. And then something on the legal status, whether free or enslaved. And then a little bit more information for enslaved people. It usually consists of just the name of the owner of the enslaved person. But sometimes there are some other references to names or to social roles in that household. As far as I know, no one has ever gone through and just systematically recorded it. People have gone through and looked for genealogical information very often, but I don't think anyone has ever just literally transcribed all of those gente de color registers. And Heather, I may be wrong on that. So if you know more about that than I do, I'm
Actually, the best person to answer that is in this meeting, and it's Lee Loomis. She will know. So Lee, if you have an answer to that, if you want to chime in via the chat, we would appreciate it.
Sure, I can do that.
Okay.
You want me to do it on the chat, or you want me to do it here?
I think saying it would be fine.
Okay. So there have been studies, and many of those records have been translated and transcribed. And as Ryan said, and I'm sorry I was late. I, for some reason, thought y'all was starting at 7, so I came on just a few minutes ago. But yeah, no, there have been several studies, especially people from France that have come over and transcribed them. Some of Emily Clark's students have transcribed them. They are available all online. The early books up to 1812 about are inscribed, as well as and have been transcribed. And it is a matter of a lot of times hunting and pecking to find out that information. And Ryan, I may send you an email on something else, because I know of another burial ground you may need to figure out something on.
A future lecture for us. Thank you so
much.
It's
the old Ursuline. It's the old. I'll tell Ryan. I'll give him the tease. It's the old Ursuline complex that is now in the Industrial River. They did have what they called. They did on that site have burial, as well as both their burials, which they moved to State Street, but also those that were enslaved that were buried on that property. So there may be another site out there.
Great, thank you so much. In case anyone doesn't know, Dr. Lee Loomis was the head of archives for the Archdiocese of New Orleans, and we are very sad that she has retired, but we try to keep her close to us because she has tons of useful knowledge. So thank you. We really appreciate you chiming in, helping us with that.
Yeah, it's good. And it's good to see you here. And yeah, Dr. Loomis was one of the people who really helped facilitate once we started to come together around this reburial process. Dr. Loomis was instrumental in that as well. So she's one of the stars here too. So thank you very much for.
Oh, you're welcome. It was fun.
Just as a follow-up to that, when I do post this video to our website at NOLACatholicCemeteries.org, I'll also add in some of those links. So if anyone is doing research and those would be helpful to you, I'll put that in our research and records tab, but I'll add that all to the post that I make announcing the publication of the video to make it a bit easier to find. Okay, the next question you've kind of answered throughout your talk, but given that the cemetery was so overpopulated, is there any thought that there could be people buried in other areas of the quarter, which you mentioned?
Yeah, well, one thing that we'll note about that is the fact that it was so overfilled, in a way almost suggests that wasn't the tradition, because if you had that option, then when you're beginning to dig graves and you're hitting other earlier graves that are still relatively fresh, then that would be the kind of motivator to go outside of those boundaries. But the fact that people are still packed in there so densely, I think shows that, already by this time that the city was keeping a pretty close eye on that, and that it wasn't like this kind of unregulated system where you could kind of put human remains anywhere, that people were looking for this specific consecrated ground. Now, in other research that we're doing right now, and this kind of going to what Dr. Loomis had mentioned, what we're beginning to see is that as in some of the plantations surrounding the city, as the city is growing to encompass them, then some of those plantations actually have designated cemetery sites. And we can almost track when those are getting encompassed by the street grid as when they kind of disappear beneath the city. So while if you were in the developed part of the city proper, there were these designated burial places, some of the plantations around the city that later got encompassed by the city had specific burial areas. And the Department of Public Works of the city has been digitizing a number of maps that they found in the basement, some of which have some interesting new information in this regard too. And we're trying to get all of that mapped out, because there are some specific possibilities out there for certain.
Great. The next question, it's a difficult question. How is it possible that no one knows what happened to the remains that were excavated in the 1970s and 1980s? And what do you think happened to them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, to me, some of this speaks to just how much the attitudes really did change in this period between the early 70s and the early 80s. And at least part of that was due to Native American activism over the issue of graves and repatriation. And that got people thinking about all of these other examples too of historic cemeteries that really just kind of got disregarded for quite some time. In a lot of these articles prior to the 1980s, there's very little record of what happened afterwards. Some of it has to do with this kind of earlier tendency of seeing cemeteries more as nuisances than sacred areas, at least for city planners, for city developers. But the 1970s case, I really have no idea what would have happened to those. Now, in the 1980s, those remains were supposed to be reburied. Actually, in one of the crypts in St. Louis Cemetery Number 1, the same one that the Office of Cemeteries arranged for us to inter the remains that we recovered in. However, when we checked there, it doesn't appear that everything from 1984 had actually been reinterred there. And we don't know why that is. We don't really know who was responsible for it. That's actually one of the reasons why we wanted to have this big public ceremony, so that if someone 20 years from now wants to come back and find out what happened, we actually have this moment, where that's marked, and we have this kind of public record of what happened to the people whose remains we recovered. The 1984 burials, I have some speculations. I think at the time people were still thinking of them as mainly in terms of research, rather than as human remains in the sense that as the sense of people. but I don't really have any evidence for what happened to them beyond that.
The next question somebody asked, where are those two plaques shown on this screen? And those are in St. Louis Cemetery number 1, and that's the one plaque dates from the interment ceremony, and the other is the plaque for the Portuguese Burial Society for the vault for that. So it's within St. Louis 1. A lot of thank yous. Where are they online? I think that you're asking about those records that Dr. Loomis mentioned, and I will provide a link to those in the future. Otherwise, you have them on the Office of Archives and Records hidden on there. So if they want to get to them sooner than me.
Page. So one of the things, the differences is there are burial books and there are cemetery books. So I know we've touched on this in the past in other talks, but so the funeral books, when they were burying, and this would be up until about 1820 or so, those are going to be just sort of the straight run funeral books that today there was a funeral mass for, whether or not they received the sacraments. This will be for the colonial people, both under the French and Spanish empires. And then after that, once we become American, the church doesn't always keep funeral books, and it's just was a practice that didn't keep up. And so because the sexton's books then, those that were burying, then traditionally became where the recordation was for a burial. So those then starting about 1824, I believe, or the late 1820s for St. Louis number 1, and then continue onward. But if you get outside of the city, of course, you have St. Bernard, and you also have St. John the Baptist in Edgard. You'll have burials there. But traditional, what we think of in the 1900s of burial books for the church, they really don't start doing really good record keeping for that until about the 1880s onward, that every church, every time they did a funeral, would actually mark it in a book. Mm-hmm. But then they don't tell you where they buried them. So
which is a constant struggle for us. Yeah, it depended who the sexton was at the time for most cases. There's a lot of comments. Go look through. Joey Lynn, I'm gonna just send that to Dr. Gray, your question, because it has to do with your ancestors, and he should be able to get you he'll send you a copy of that one image.
And you can actually find that on the Constable, the Vieux Carré survey that the HNOC has online. I meant to go back and add the link to that.
I could add a link to, when I post it, I'll add that link too. You'll have a whole bunch of links you'll be like us, just spending all this time looking at pictures of cemetery maps on the internet. Do you have any info on the remains from the old Protestant burial grounds that were reinterred? Not sure.
So you're the ones from the 1908 that are these, or a different one?
Teresa, if you can follow up with your question, letting us know which one we'll be able to better answer.
Yeah, someone else mentioned the Gerard Street Cemetery, and of course, that too had a substantial underground component that still shows up occasionally, basically any of the above ground cemeteries, there, in almost every case, there also is a below ground component. It's just the above ground part is what lasts, is what you see, and it makes it harder for that to be moved. But for archaeologists, we always assume anytime that a cemetery has been moved, that it actually just means that whatever was on top of the ground has been moved. And at best, someone did a very hasty job of removing below ground interments, because it's not easy, and it's and not pleasant, and even when they do a good job of it, a thorough job of it, as happened with the Jewish cemetery on Jackson, there are still invariably going to be, at a forensic level, human remains left behind. And so there is this kind of question then, does that still constitute a cemetery if there have been people made the attempt to move human remains, and but there are a few pieces left behind. And actually, Ryan Seidemann from the Department of Justice, or the Attorney General's office for the state, has been looking into that issue in some detail because it comes up around the city, perhaps more often than you might expect. This case of this 1908 case with the Frisco Trench, well, we have no idea what happened to those. We know that the fire company that was located on Basin Street, that's referenced in that article, had their own, had boxes of human remains like on the shelves in the back of the fire station in 1908. But we don't know what happened beyond that. We only have the references from these few newspaper articles from the time. And I'm actually a little bit skeptical of the identification of it as just the Protestant cemetery, because St. Louis Cemetery was so much bigger at one point. I think there are different categories in some of those unmarked areas around it. But when they did the archaeological testing in advance of the Iberville redevelopment, they found that there was still a line of timbers, and just disregard this green line because it's not relevant here, but this place where you can see this overlay of the earlier map boundaries, there was actually still a preserved fence line that actually matched what would have been the edge of the cemetery in 1834. That was still preserved 4 feet beneath the ground, following that outline. So the St. Louis Cemetery number 1 is a very special case with its earlier footprints.
And then Mary Ann asked a question. Dr. Loomis responded via chat, but I think I'll read it because I think it might be helpful to some other people. So she asked, are there burial books available for St. Bernard Catholic Cemetery? And then Dr. Loomis replied that most of the early St. Bernard funeral registers will just state that the person who was buried in the church cemetery. It will not give a location. And that's pretty much the answer to many of our historic interment books and funeral registries. They don't give an exact location within the cemeteries. It's really unfortunate. I always tell people I wish I had a time machine, because that's something I would definitely go back and require them to tell us. Sometimes for cemeteries that we have historic maps available, you can glean a little bit of information, because sometimes the surname of the plot owner is listed on it. So you can kind of tell. A lot of it is just knowing that if you have a family tomb within a cemetery, it's likely that most of your family was interred within that tomb. So I wish there was a better answer. We covered that a lot in our 6-part genealogical workshop series, which was a partnership between the New Orleans Public Library and the Office of Archives and Records. All of that is available on our website. It's 6 hours of genealogical help for everyone. It's broken down into different categories to make it easier. I'm also always happy to answer questions if people want to email me. I love the detective work involved in some of this. So I might not get back to you right away, but I'll definitely try my best to help you think of options to locate locations within a cemetery. Any other questions? We are, I think, maybe do one or two more, but other than that, please take advantage of Dr. Gray's email address. Email him with any questions that you have specific to maybe your ancestors or specific questions. And thank you all so much for coming. In January, I think it's January 15th, but I'll send out an announcement. We're going to have another lecture on genetic genealogy, hosted by Dr. Michelle Bell-Bossier from Xavier University. She's the head of the biology department over there. So that should be really interesting to help us in our ancestry search. Her and her family are currently restoring one of their tombs in St. Louis Cemetery number 2. So I think she's going to also speak a little bit about understanding more about her family through genetic testing and who her ancestors were compared to who she thought they were, which should be fascinating. So please follow us on Facebook, sign up for our digital newsletter, which you can do on nolacatholiccemeteries.org. We send them out once a month, and my email address, you all email to register, but please follow up if you have any questions for me. And thank you so much, Dr. Gray and Dr. Loomis, for being with us here tonight and helping bring this information to the public.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. And I will mention that I am doing another talk in February, and my book came out basically the same month that the lockdowns for the pandemic started, and so I've done very little kind of public promotion of it. But my Friends of the Cabildo book talk is scheduled for February now, and I assume it will be online still. But anyway, hope to see some of you there as well. And thank you everyone for sticking with us. I always run long with the talks on St. Peter Street, but it's a topic that's really dear to me, and so and I hope we'll see some new progress made in marking and memorializing some of these spaces in the near future.
Great, thank you. I'm just gonna, one last question is kind of how is preservation being handled in St. Louis? One, now that it has become a tourist destination. Tourism in general, we get a lot of tourists throughout all of our cemeteries. We have quite a few preservation initiatives currently happening. We're currently digitally mapping all 13 of our cemeteries. I just completed a tomb by tomb condition assessment for every single tomb in St. Louis Cemetery number 2, which we are using to prioritize repairs in there. And we're about to start a collaborative partnership to try to address some of the larger abandoned society tombs in St. Louis 2, and then also bring that work into St. Louis 1. So if you're following us on any of those channels that I mentioned, I try to put out the word because we are busy all the time, but we're really committed to preservation and restoration work. And I think every year it's growing, the programs that we have, but a lot of it relies on donations from the public. So if you are interested in helping with our restoration work, there's a link also on our website for that, and to learn more about the different initiatives and programs that we have currently in place. But so thank you all. And then I will definitely let you know when this is up and published on the website. But thank you again. Have a great night.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you.